Throughout the vast expanse of human history, before the rise of patriarchal religions and the systematic erasure of ancient knowledge, civilizations across the globe revered a powerful force that modern scholars now identify as the sacred feminine. This concept, far from being a singular deity or religious practice, represented a complex web of symbols, beliefs, and cultural expressions that acknowledged the creative, nurturing, and transformative power inherent in feminine energy and the natural world. Archaeological evidence dating back to the Paleolithic era reveals that our ancestors possessed a profound understanding of this principle, one that would be systematically hidden, suppressed, and nearly forgotten over thousands of years. The story of the sacred feminine is not merely an academic curiosity or a footnote in anthropological studies. It represents one of the most significant cultural shifts in human consciousness, a transformation that fundamentally altered how societies organized themselves, understood the cosmos, and related to the forces of nature. To understand this hidden truth, we must journey back to a time when the earth itself was seen as a living goddess, when the cycles of the moon were celebrated as sacred mysteries, and when symbols of feminine power adorned temples, shrines, and sacred spaces throughout the ancient world. The earliest known representations of the sacred feminine appear in the form of small figurines carved from stone, bone, and ivory during the Upper Paleolithic period, approximately 25 to 30,000 years ago. Among the most famous of these artifacts is the Venus of Willendorf, discovered in Austria in 1908. This small limestone statuette, standing just over 4 inches tall, depicts a female figure with exaggerated breasts, belly, and hips, while the face remains featureless and abstract. For decades, archaeologists and historians have debated the meaning and purpose of this figurine and hundreds of similar objects found across Europe and Asia. Some scholars interpret these Venus figurines as fertility symbols, magical objects meant to ensure successful childbirth and abundant harvests. Others suggest they may have represented a great mother goddess, a primordial deity who presided over life, death, and rebirth. Regardless of their specific function, these ancient sculptures demonstrate that Paleolithic peoples invested significant time and skill into creating representations of the female form, emphasizing the aspects most closely associated with the creation and nurturing of life. The absence of facial features on many of these figurines is particularly intriguing, as it suggests that the artists were not attempting to portray individual women but rather an archetypal principle, a universal force embodied in feminine symbolism. As human societies transitioned from nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyles to settled agricultural communities during the Neolithic Revolution, the worship of the sacred feminine evolved and became more complex. The discovery of cultivation and the domestication of plants created new metaphors and meanings for ancient peoples. Just as women brought forth children from their bodies, so too did the earth bring forth vegetation, grain, and sustenance for entire communities. This parallel was not lost on our ancestors, who began to develop elaborate religious and symbolic systems centered around earth goddesses and agricultural deities. In ancient Mesopotamia, one of the cradles of civilization, the goddess Inanna, later known as Ishtar, reigned as the queen of heaven and earth. Her myths describe her descent into the underworld and subsequent resurrection, a narrative that scholars interpret as an allegorical representation of the agricultural cycle, with seeds planted in the dark earth only to emerge again as new growth. Inanna's symbols included the 8-pointed star and the lion, creatures of power and majesty. She embodied not only fertility and love but also war and political authority, demonstrating that ancient conceptions of the feminine divine were far more multifaceted than modern stereotypes might suggest. The ancient Egyptians developed their own rich tradition of goddess worship, with deities like Isis, Hathor, and Mot playing central roles in religious life and cosmic understanding. Isis, perhaps the most beloved goddess in the Egyptian pantheon, was revered as the ideal mother and wife, the patron of nature and magic, and the protector of the dead. Her cult spread throughout the Mediterranean world, and temples dedicated to her worship could be found from the Nile Valley to ancient Rome. Hathor, depicted as a cow or as a woman with cow's horns, represented motherhood, joy, music, and love, while also serving as a goddess of the sky and the afterlife. Mot, personifying truth, justice, and cosmic order, was depicted wearing an ostrich feather, and ancient Egyptians believed that the hearts of the deceased would be weighed against her feather in the judgment of the dead. These goddesses were not mere mythological characters but were understood as active forces in the universe, essential to maintaining the balance and harmony of existence. The sacred feminine in Egypt was intimately connected with concepts of Ma'at, the cosmic order that governed both the natural world and human society. On the island of Crete, the Minoan civilization flourished between approximately 3000 and 1100 BCE, and archaeological evidence suggests that this culture may have been organized around goddess worship and perhaps even governed by priestesses rather than kings. The famous snake goddess figurines, dating to around 1600 BCE, depict elegantly dressed women holding serpents in their raised hands, their breasts exposed in a gesture that may symbolize nurturing, sexuality, or the power to sustain life. The snake, in many ancient cultures, represented transformation, healing, and regeneration due to its ability to shed its skin and appear renewed. In the context of Cretan religion, serpents may have also symbolized chthonic powers, connections to the earth and the underworld, and the cyclical nature of existence. The Minoan palaces, with their elaborate frescoes, sophisticated architecture, and apparent lack of military fortifications, suggest a society quite different from the warrior cultures that would later dominate the Mediterranean. While scholars continue to debate the exact nature of Minoan religion and social organization, the prominence of female imagery in their art and the apparent centrality of goddess figures in their religious life indicate that the sacred feminine held a position of extraordinary importance in this ancient civilization. In ancient Greece, despite the patriarchal nature of classical Greek society, echoes of earlier goddess worship persisted in mythology and religious practice. Gaia, the primordial earth goddess, was described by the poet Hesiod in his Theogony as one of the first beings to emerge from primordial chaos, giving birth to the sky, the mountains, and the sea. She was understood as the fundamental ground of existence, the literal and metaphorical foundation upon which all life depended. The Eleusinian Mysteries, among the most sacred and secret religious rites in the ancient world, centered around the goddesses Demeter and Persephone and their myth of separation, descent into the underworld, and reunion. These mysteries, which promised initiates a blessed afterlife and a deeper understanding of the cycles of nature, remained influential for nearly 2,000 years. From approximately 1500 BCE until they were forcibly closed by Christian emperors in the 4th century CE, the enduring power of these goddess-centered rites demonstrates that even as Greek society became increasingly dominated by male gods and male political authority, the sacred feminine retained a vital and irreplaceable role in religious consciousness. Beyond the Mediterranean world, goddess worship and sacred feminine symbolism appeared in cultures throughout the globe. In the ancient Turkic peoples' mythology, Umi served as the Great Mother, protector of women and children, embodiment of fertility and the life-giving forces of nature. Among various Native American tribes, Spider Grandmother was revered as a creator deity who wove the fabric of time and reality itself, bringing life and wisdom to the world. In Hinduism, the concept of Shakti represents the divine feminine energy that animates the universe, manifesting in goddesses like Durga, Kali, and Lakshmi, each embodying different aspects of cosmic power. The lotus flower, sacred in both Hindu and Buddhist traditions, became a universal symbol of feminine beauty, purity, and spiritual enlightenment, its ability to emerge pristine from muddy water serving as a metaphor for transcendence and rebirth. These diverse cultural expressions, separated by vast distances and developing independently over millennia, all recognized and honored a fundamental principle, a sacred power associated with the feminine, with creation, with the earth, and with the mysterious processes of life, death, and transformation. The symbols through which ancient cultures expressed these concepts were remarkably varied yet shared common themes. The spiral, found in Neolithic carvings throughout Europe and appearing prominently in Celtic art, represented the cycles of time, the journey from birth to death to rebirth, and the flowing of energy from the internal to the external world. The spiral goddess symbol, with arms upraised in celebration and a spiral at the center of the belly, embodied feminine power, fertility, creativity, and the cyclical nature of existence. The moon, with its visible phases of waxing, fullness, and waning, became perhaps the most universal symbol of the sacred feminine, its cycles mirroring the menstrual cycles of women and the rhythms of agricultural life. Crescents, full circles, and triple moon symbols appeared in countless cultures as representations of the goddess in her various aspects: maiden, mother, and crone. Water, Essential for all life, flowing and adaptive yet possessing the power to carve stone and shape landscapes, became associated with feminine qualities of intuition, emotion, and the subconscious mind. Rivers were often personified as goddesses, and bodies of water served as sacred sites for ritual and worship. The chalice or cup, as a vessel that receives and contains, became another potent symbol of the sacred feminine, later appearing in Christian symbolism as the Holy Grail, though its origins extend far deeper into pre-Christian pagan traditions. The gradual suppression and concealment of sacred feminine symbolism and goddess-centered religious practices represents one of the most profound transformations in human cultural and spiritual history. This process did not occur overnight, nor was it the result of a single conspiratorial effort. Rather, it unfolded over thousands of years through a complex interplay of social, political, economic, and religious factors that fundamentally reshaped how human societies understood gender, power, divinity, and the natural world. Scholars from various disciplines, including archaeology, anthropology, religious studies, and history, have traced this transformation, examining the evidence left behind in ancient texts, architectural remains, and cultural artifacts. What emerges from this research is a picture of gradual but systematic change, as societies that once honored feminine divine principles increasingly elevated masculine deities and male authority structures, relegating the sacred feminine to the margins of religious life or reinterpreting it in ways that diminished its power and significance. The shift from goddess-centered to God-centered religious systems appears to have coincided with broader changes in social organization, particularly the transition from egalitarian or matrilineal societies to more hierarchical, patriarchal structures. Some researchers, drawing on archaeological evidence from Neolithic settlements, have proposed that early agricultural communities may have been relatively egalitarian, with women holding significant social and religious authority due to their roles as life-givers and their knowledge of plant cultivation. However, as these societies grew larger and more complex, as populations increased and resources became more contested, new forms of social organization emerged. The development of bronze and iron metallurgy, which enabled more effective weapons and tools, may have contributed to the rise of warrior cultures in which male physical strength and military prowess became increasingly valued. Indo-European migrations, beginning around 4000 BCE and continuing for millennia, brought groups with strongly patriarchal social structures and sky god worship into regions where earth goddess veneration had previously predominated. These migrations and conquests did not simply replace one set of beliefs with another. Instead, they initiated a long process of cultural blending, adaptation, and eventual subordination of feminine divine figures. In ancient Mesopotamia, historians have observed a gradual shift in religious prominence from goddesses to gods over the course of several millennia. During the Sumerian period, goddesses like Inanna held positions of supreme importance, with extensive temple complexes and priesthoods dedicated to their worship. However, as political power became increasingly centralized and militarized, male deities such as Marduk in Babylon and Ashur in Assyria rose to prominence, often through mythological narratives that depicted them conquering or subordinating earlier divine powers. The Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, provides a striking example of this pattern. In this myth, the young god Marduk defeats Tiamat, the primordial goddess of the Salt Sea, by killing her and splitting her body in half to create the heavens and the earth. Scholars interpret this narrative as a symbolic representation of the triumph of patriarchal order over earlier matriarchal or egalitarian systems, with the violent subjugation of the goddess serving as a metaphor for broader social and religious transformations. The feminine divine was not entirely eliminated from Mesopotamian religion, but goddesses increasingly became consorts, daughters, or subordinate figures to the male gods who now dominated the pantheon. Similar patterns emerged in ancient Greece, where the transition from Bronze Age Minoan and Mycenaean cultures to the Iron Age Greek civilization brought significant changes in religious emphasis. The Olympian pantheon, as codified in works like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey and Hesiod's Theogony, featured powerful goddesses such as Athena, Artemis, and Hera, but ultimate authority rested with Zeus, the sky father who ruled from Mount Olympus. Greek mythology contains numerous stories of Zeus and other male gods overpowering, violating, or subordinating goddesses and mortal women, narratives that many scholars interpret as reflecting and reinforcing patriarchal social structures. The Eleusinian mysteries and other goddess-centered rites continued to play important roles in Greek religious life, but they increasingly existed as exceptions within a predominantly male-controlled religious and political system. Philosophy, as it developed in classical Greece, tended to associate rationality, order, and the divine with masculine principles, while linking femininity with matter, chaos, and the material world that must be transcended to achieve true knowledge or spiritual enlightenment. The rise of monotheistic religions, particularly Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, marked another major phase in the suppression of sacred feminine symbolism and goddess worship. These traditions, emerging from the ancient Near East and strongly influenced by patriarchal tribal cultures, centered their theology on a singular masculine deity. In the Hebrew Bible, prophets and kings repeatedly condemned the worship of Asherah, a Canaanite goddess whose cult apparently flourished alongside Yahweh worship in ancient Israel and Judah, despite official disapproval. Archaeological excavations have uncovered numerous figurines and inscriptions suggesting that many ordinary Israelites venerated Asherah as the consort of Yahweh or as a separate divine figure worthy of devotion. The biblical texts themselves contain numerous references to these practices, always presented negatively as idolatry that must be stamped out. This pattern of condemnation reveals the persistence of goddess worship and sacred feminine traditions among the populace, even as religious authorities worked to eliminate them. Christianity, as it spread throughout the Roman Empire and beyond, encountered numerous cultures with strong goddess traditions. In some cases, Christian missionaries and theologians adapted local goddess imagery and symbolism, redirecting devotion toward the Virgin Mary or female saints rather than attempting total eradication. The cult of Mary, while officially subordinate to the worship of God the Father and Jesus Christ, incorporated many elements of earlier goddess veneration. Mary became known as the Queen of Heaven, a title previously applied to goddesses like Inanna and Isis. She was invoked as a compassionate mother who intercedes on behalf of suffering humanity, echoing the roles of ancient mother goddesses. Sites sacred to pre-Christian goddesses were sometimes converted into churches dedicated to Mary, allowing for a degree of continuity even as the official theology changed. However, this adaptation came at a significant cost. Mary, unlike the powerful goddesses of antiquity who embodied sexuality, independence, and divine authority, was venerated primarily for her virginity, her obedience, and her suffering. The model of womanhood she represented was far more constrained than those offered by deities like Inanna, Isis, or Athena. Beyond the adaptation of goddess imagery, Christianity and later Islam actively suppressed pagan religious practices throughout the regions they came to dominate. Temples were destroyed or converted to churches and mosques. Sacred groves were cut down. Priestesses and practitioners of traditional religions faced persecution, forced conversion, or death. The infamous witch trials of early modern Europe, which resulted in the execution of tens of thousands of people, primarily women, between the 15th and 18th centuries, represented an extreme manifestation of this suppression. While the relationship between witch hunting and pre-Christian paganism is complex and often overstated in popular literature, historians note that many of the practices condemned as witchcraft, such as herbalism, midwifery, healing, and folk magic, were traditional areas of female knowledge and authority that had ancient roots. The systematic persecution of women accused of witchcraft not only eliminated countless individuals but also served to intimidate entire communities, discouraging the transmission of traditional knowledge and practices from one generation to the next. The symbolic systems through which the sacred feminine had been expressed and understood were also systematically devalued or reinterpreted. The serpent, once a symbol of wisdom, healing, and transformation associated with numerous goddesses, became in Judeo-Christian tradition the embodiment of evil and temptation, the creature that brought about humanity's fall from grace in the Garden of Eden. The moon, associated with feminine cycles and goddess worship, was relegated to a lesser status than the sun, which became linked with masculine divine power and rationality. Nature itself, once revered as the living body of the goddess, became in Christian theology a mere creation, separate from and inferior to the divine, existing for human use and exploitation. The chalice, the vessel that receives and nurtures, was reinterpreted in Christian symbolism as the cup of Christ's sacrifice, its feminine associations obscured or forgotten. Even the concept of wisdom, personified in Jewish tradition as Sophia, a feminine divine figure, was eventually masculinized or absorbed into the masculine logos, the Word made flesh in Christian theology. The impact of this suppression extended far beyond the realm of religion and symbol. As the sacred feminine was pushed to the margins of cultural consciousness, societies developed philosophical and theological frameworks that justified male dominance and female subordination. Aristotle, one of the most influential philosophers in Western history, argued that women were defective men, naturally inferior and properly subject to male authority. Early Christian theologians debated whether women even possessed souls in the same way men did. Medieval scholastic philosophy positioned women closer to matter and nature, while men were associated with spirit and reason. These ideas, presented as natural truths or divine decree, shaped laws, social customs, and institutions for centuries, creating systems in which women had limited legal rights, restricted access to education and religious authority, and little control over their own bodies and lives. The devaluation of the sacred feminine in religious and symbolic systems paralleled and reinforced the subordination of actual women in social and political structures. Yet despite centuries of suppression, sacred feminine symbolism never entirely disappeared. It went underground, persisting in folk traditions, fairy tales, and mystical movements that operated at the margins of official religious orthodoxy. In medieval Christian mysticism, figures like Hildegard of Bingen and Julian of Norwich experienced visions and wrote theological works that incorporated feminine imagery for the divine, describing God as mother as well as father, and emphasizing nurturing, compassionate aspects of divine nature. The Cathar movement in medieval France, brutally suppressed through Crusade and Inquisition, apparently accorded women significant religious authority and may have preserved elements of earlier dualistic traditions that honored feminine spiritual principles. Alchemy, with its emphasis on the union of masculine and feminine principles to achieve transformation and perfection, kept alive symbolic systems that acknowledged the necessity and power of the feminine, even when cloaked in obscure language and mysterious imagery. Folk customs surrounding the cycles of the agricultural year, celebrations of the harvest, rituals to ensure fertility of crops and animals, often preserved pre-Christian elements and acknowledged, if only implicitly, the generative power of the earth and the feminine forces of nature. The rediscovery of sacred feminine symbolism and the scholarly investigation into ancient goddess traditions represents one of the most fascinating developments in modern archaeology, anthropology, and religious studies. Beginning in the 19th century and accelerating dramatically in the 20th and 21st centuries, researchers have uncovered vast amounts of evidence demonstrating the central importance of feminine divine figures and symbols in ancient cultures worldwide. This scholarly work has not only expanded our understanding of human religious history but has also prompted broader conversations about gender, power, and the cultural narratives that shape societies. The story of how these hidden truths came to light reveals as much about modern culture and its concerns as it does about ancient beliefs and practices. The systematic archaeological excavation of ancient sites beginning in the 19th century brought to light artifacts and structures that challenged prevailing assumptions about the universality of patriarchal religious systems. When Heinrich Schliemann excavated Troy and Mycenae in the 1870s, and when Arthur Evans uncovered the Minoan Palace at Knossos in the early 20th century, they revealed civilizations whose religious imagery prominently featured female figures and goddess symbols. The thousands of Venus figurines discovered across Europe and Asia, dating from the Paleolithic and Neolithic periods, presented undeniable evidence that early human cultures created representations of the female form with apparent ritual or religious significance. Archaeologist Maria Gimbutas, working in the mid to late 20th century, conducted extensive research on Neolithic cultures in southeastern Europe, arguing that these societies were relatively peaceful, egalitarian, and centered around goddess worship before being disrupted by invasions of patriarchal Indo-European peoples. While some of Gimbutas's specific conclusions remain controversial among scholars, her work undeniably brought attention to the prevalence and significance of feminine symbolism in prehistoric Europe. The decipherment of ancient languages and the translation of previously inaccessible texts provided further evidence of the sacred feminine's prominence in early civilizations. Cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia revealed extensive mythological cycles centered around goddesses like Inanna and Ishtar, demonstrating their power and importance in Sumerian and Akkadian religious thought. Egyptian hieroglyphic texts illuminated the central roles of Isis, Hathor, and other goddesses in the religious life of ancient Egypt. Sanskrit texts from India described the concept of Shakti and the various manifestations of the divine feminine in Hindu tradition. These written sources complemented the archaeological evidence, providing narratives, hymns, prayers, and theological concepts that gave voice to the symbols and artifacts recovered from ancient sites. Scholars could now not only see that ancient peoples created images of goddesses but could also read their words about these divine figures, understanding something of how they conceived of feminine sacred power. As this evidence accumulated, researchers began to ask broader questions about the relationship between religious symbolism and social structures. If many ancient societies honored goddesses and employed sacred feminine symbolism, what did this suggest about gender relations in those cultures? Some scholars argued that goddess worship correlated with higher social status for women, pointing to evidence of female religious leaders, property ownership by women, and matrilineal inheritance patterns in certain ancient societies. Others cautioned against assuming direct correlations, noting that patriarchal societies could and did worship goddesses, and that the presence of feminine divine figures did not necessarily translate into earthly power for mortal women. The question of whether true matriarchal societies, in which women held political and social dominance over men, ever existed remains contentious among anthropologists and historians. Most scholars today argue that while many societies may have been matrilineal or matrilocal, and while women may have held significant authority in certain spheres, true matriarchies analogous to historical patriarchies are not well documented in the archaeological or ethnographic record. Regardless of debates about matriarchy, the recovery of knowledge about ancient goddess traditions had a profound impact on modern culture, particularly from the mid-20th century onward. The feminist movements of the 1960s and 1970s drew on this research, with activists and scholars arguing that the suppression of the sacred feminine in Western religious traditions had contributed to the subordination of women in Western societies. Books like Merlin Stone's When God Was a Woman, published in 1976, and Riane Easler's The Chalice and the Blade, published in 1987, brought scholarly research about ancient goddess worship to popular audiences, arguing that human societies had once been more egalitarian and partnership-oriented before patriarchal systems took hold. While academic historians critiqued some of the broader claims made in these popular works, the basic insight that goddess worship had been widespread and then systematically suppressed gained wide acceptance. The late 20th and early 21st centuries witnessed a remarkable flourishing of interest in sacred feminine symbolism across various cultural contexts. Artists incorporated goddess imagery and ancient feminine symbols into their work, creating visual representations that reinterpreted traditional motifs for contemporary audiences. Writers explored goddess mythologies in novels, poetry, and creative nonfiction, imagining the inner lives of ancient priestesses and the civilizations they inhabited. Museums mounted exhibitions dedicated to goddess figures from around the world, educating the public about the diversity and richness of sacred feminine traditions. Academic programs in women's studies, gender studies, and religious studies incorporated coursework on goddess traditions and feminine symbolism, training new generations of scholars to investigate these topics with sophisticated methodological approaches. This cultural renaissance did not represent a return to ancient paganism but rather a scholarly and artistic engagement with historical traditions that had been marginalized or forgotten. The symbols themselves, hidden for so long or stripped of their original meanings, began to be understood once again in their full complexity and power. The spiral, carved on megalithic monuments like Newgrange in Ireland 5,000 years ago, was recognized not merely as decorative but as a representation of cosmic cycles, the journey of transformation, and the flowing of energy between inner and outer worlds. The triple moon symbol, showing the crescent, full, and waning moon, was understood as representing the three aspects of the goddess and the three phases of a woman's life, a recognition of the sacred nature of aging and the wisdom that comes with experience. The lotus, emerging pristine from muddy water, symbolized the potential for spiritual transcendence present even in difficult circumstances, a message of hope and transformation. The chalice or cup, used in ritual contexts for thousands of years, represented receptivity, the capacity to receive and nurture, qualities devalued in cultures that emphasized aggressive action and domination but essential to the sustenance of life and community. Contemporary scholars emphasize that understanding these symbols requires historical and cultural context rather than simplistic or universal interpretations. The meaning of a particular goddess figure or sacred symbol varied considerably depending on the specific culture, time period, and social context in which it appeared. The Venus of Willendorf may have served a different purpose than the Minoan snake goddess, even though both are female figures created in ancient times. Inanna's warrior aspects made her quite different from the nurturing characteristics emphasized in depictions of the Egyptian goddess Isis, though both were important goddesses in their respective cultures. Modern scholars caution against projecting contemporary values and assumptions onto ancient symbols, urging careful attention to the specific archaeological and textual evidence rather than generalizations about universal goddess archetypes. This nuanced, evidence-based approach allows for a deeper and more accurate understanding of how ancient peoples actually conceived of and related to sacred feminine figures and symbols. The legacy of the sacred feminine and its long concealment continues to resonate in contemporary culture and scholarship. Historians examining the witch trials of early modern Europe now understand these persecutions not simply as a rational fear of the supernatural but as complex phenomena involving gender politics, economic factors, religious conflict, and the suppression of traditional knowledge systems, many of which were associated with women. Environmentalists and eco-philosophers point to the ancient understanding of the earth as a living, sacred entity, worthy of reverence and care, as an alternative to exploitative attitudes toward nature that have contributed to ecological crisis. Psychologists and mythologists, following in the tradition of Carl Jung, explore the archetypal significance of feminine symbols in the human psyche, investigating how images of the Great Mother, the Wise Woman, and the Divine Feminine appear across cultures and continue to resonate in dreams, art, and literature. These diverse fields of inquiry, while maintaining scholarly rigor and critical thinking, acknowledge that the recovery of knowledge about sacred feminine traditions offers valuable perspectives on human culture, consciousness, and possibility. The symbols that were hidden for thousands of years, suppressed by changing religious and political systems, devalued and nearly forgotten, have not been entirely lost. They persist in archaeological sites around the world, waiting to be excavated and interpreted. They survive in folk traditions, fairy tales, and cultural practices that preserve ancient wisdom even when its origins are no longer consciously remembered. They appear in the human imagination, in the dreams and creative expressions of people who may have no formal knowledge of ancient goddess traditions, but who nonetheless tap into archetypal patterns that have shaped human consciousness for millennia. The rediscovery of the sacred feminine is not a simple recovery of the past, but an ongoing process of interpretation, understanding, and cultural creation. As each generation encounters these ancient symbols and considers what wisdom they might offer for contemporary life. Understanding the history of the sacred feminine and its suppression does not require adopting any particular religious or spiritual practice. Rather, it invites reflection on how cultural narratives shape societies, how power operates through symbolic systems, and how the recovery of marginalized histories can expand our understanding of human possibility. The ancient peoples who carved spirals on megalithic tombs, who fashioned images of goddesses from stone and clay, who built temples to honor Inanna, Isis, and countless other divine feminine figures, left behind evidence of worldviews quite different from those that would later dominate much of human civilization. By studying this evidence with scholarly care and historical sensitivity, we gain not only knowledge about the past but also perspective on the present, recognizing that the ways we organize societies, conceive of the divine, and relate to the natural world are not inevitable or universal but rather are cultural constructions that have changed dramatically over time and could change again. The truth about the sacred feminine, hidden for thousands of years, continues to emerge through patient scholarship, archaeological discovery, and thoughtful interpretation, offering insights into the rich complexity of human religious and cultural history.